Okay, so we've kind of explained then the difference in types of load in terms of the magnitude of load and frequency, and how this is really important to understand the internal loads that get placed on musculoskeletal tissue. Now, the other interesting thing here is we've kind of captured what might happen, say, in one session, but really what is also important here is the load history. Now, the load history means that your musculoskeletal tissues will adapt to the load, not only that you experienced during this one session, but the loads that those tissues were experienced during other sessions. So this is really where it then becomes important to monitor the types of loads in terms of frequency and magnitude over multiple sessions. And this is where our concept of cumulative load comes in. It's the accumulation of loads that are really important here, particularly for the injury that is a fatigue-related injury, where after a period of time that load suddenly leads to damage. If you don't have enough recovery of the tissue, that can lead to failure of the tissue. And so that cumulative bone load, there's been quite a lot of research done on that, and it turns out that a lot of musculoskeletal tissue, particularly bone, responds more to the magnitude of load than it does the frequency. So let me draw some examples of what I mean here. Now, if you imagine then these little cells that are sitting in your bone, these cells have to respond to some sort of load. So there's a load placed on the bone. Those cells have to know when the bone has been loaded, and they have to respond. And so if you think about this in terms of the response of that cell, what typically happens is those cells that are sitting inside the bone, they get loaded, they sense that load, and they have some sort of response. Now, the response looks something like this, where initially you get some sort of load stimulus being applied here, and then the cell will respond, but after a period of time, this response gets less and less. And this is what you might think of as saturation. The cell has been activated, and it gets to a point where it no longer is having a change in terms of a stimulus. And if you think about this in terms of bone mineral density, the density of our bones, this might explain why you and I perhaps don't have the same sort of bone mineral density as someone who's, say, a marathon runner who's experiencing very large loads over a long period of time. But this curve here also explains why that marathon runner doesn't have bone mineral density that's, say, 10 or 20 times you and I, because it only has to experience that load over a few cycles, and suddenly you get this point where it saturates. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because we need to know these time periods. We need to know when is the tissue loaded, how much rest there is, and the cycles in between these loads, because this is really what is then driving the modeling or remodeling response of bone and other tissues in our body. So what we do is we take the information that's within the literature, within the scientific literature, and we put that into our algorithms that say we know that load is important, and we know that cells will respond more to the magnitude of load rather than the frequency. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if, for example, I have these cells that are within my bone, and we want to know, well, what is their response? We know that if we have a larger load, we get a bigger response from that cell. So you can imagine then if you have a bigger stimulus here, you actually can get a bigger response. And so bone likes to be loaded, and it likes to be loaded with higher impacts. And it's for this reason why the swimmer is at risk of having poor bone mineral health or bone mineral density, because they're not experiencing these large impact loads. In fact, they're not getting any impact loads at all. So the swimmer, unfortunately, might be in this state in terms of their bone health. So they're getting a very low response from those cells sitting in the tissue. So with our software and our algorithms, what we're doing then is taking this information from the literature and giving the tools then to individuals to be able to characterize their individual response and monitor cumulative load over a longer period of time.